Hi, today we're going to be looking at the issue of animal ethics. We have 3 videos for this. The first is just your basic intro to the topic, and then after this we'll move on to the work of some philosophers that are putting forth some specific arguments on the ethical treatment of animals, and specifically how we ought to regard animals within our moral community, if at all. Okay, so the big question when we're talking about animal ethics is how we ought to regard animals in terms of morality. And the question that I have here is, do non-human animals have moral standing? Human beings are animals too, so that's why I have non-human there in parentheses. But when we want to figure out what our moral responsibilities are towards animals, the first question that we have to ask is, are they the types of things that we need to take into account at all when we're making moral decisions? So when someone or something has moral standing, it just means that we have to take that individual's interest into account when making moral decisions. So having moral standing is like being a part of the moral community. We already saw that some philosophers that we looked at in the first half of the class do think that animals have moral standing, the utilitarians, for example, and other philosophers think that they don't. So what we're really looking at here is how to determine whether a particular entity, whether a human, animal, or something else, has any moral standing and is part of the moral community, and what it would mean to accept those standards of moral standing. So some relevant considerations here are, can animals be wronged? In other words, can I do something that we would say is an affront or a harm or a wrong to an animal, not to its owner or to other people around us, but to the animal itself? Do animals have interests? In other words, do they have things that either by instinct or by intention they are seeking to do, other things that they're trying to avoid? And should animals have any rights? Now, one important thing to keep in mind is that when we talk about rights for animals, we're talking about what's called moral rights. Moral rights and legal rights are different things. When we talk about legal rights, we're talking about rights to do things that are granted by the law, the right to vote, the right to drive, those kinds of things. Nobody is arguing that animals ought to be given driver's licenses or given the right to vote or be treated exactly like human beings. When we talk about animals having moral rights, though, what we mean is that they have some basic rights as living things that we might violate by doing certain things to them. So my basic right to life would be an example of that some people might argue for. And then we would also have to articulate our reasons, of course. So the idea here is that we can't just make claims about animals' moral status without being able to back them up. And oftentimes, this is an issue that philosophers and lay people haven't really spent a lot of time contemplating. We have opinions on this, but when we try to unpack those opinions, they're not as well articulated and well thought out as we think. So on the question of interests and whether animals... Okay, so on the topic of interest, one thing that we need to figure out is whether non-human animals can be said to have any interests. And this is going to be a prerequisite for talking about whether they might have some things that we need to consider when we're making ethical decisions. So to have interests means to have desires, projects, or goals. This is going to tie into Regan's idea about being the experiencing subject of a life. So keep that in mind as we move forward. Now, these don't have to be consciously held or articulated. In other words, I don't have to be able to say, here's my big list of life goals and projects. It may be an unconscious or unarticulated desire. For example, even a newborn baby has desires for things like food and sleep and companionship, being held by their parent. And those aren't necessarily conscious or articulated desires, but they are still interests that newborn infant has. When we're talking about interests, they don't have to be things that you are aware of or able to speak about. This is usually, though, a prerequisite for being wronged. When we're talking about someone or something being wronged, usually what we're talking about is in some way inhibiting or preventing them from achieving their interests. So to go back to my infant example, if that infant needed food and we didn't provide it, we would be wronging that infant, even though he or she can't yet express and articulate and reason about what they need. So this is going to relate to theories of moral standing. Some people say that even just having interests, having certain desires, projects, or goals, whether articulated and conscious or unarticulated and unconscious, grants that individual some kind of membership into the moral community, grants them some kind of moral standing. So when we think about interests, we can sort of divide these into what we would consider natural or instinctual interests and more intentional interests. Remaining biologically alive. This is something that we might even apply to plant life and things like that. Avoiding pain and suffering. Remember back with utilitarianism, we talked about something called sentience, which is the ability to feel pain. Any sentient animal who can feel pain probably has an interest in avoiding that sensation. The interest in reproducing is another natural interest that most animal and plant species have. Whereas when we're talking about intentional interest, choosing a course of action, making long or short-term plans, and being aware of the past, present, and future. These are basic elements of intentional action and of forming relationships as well. So a lot of people might look at this list and say, well, clearly human beings are capable of the things in the right-hand column of intentional action, but animals are only capable of the things in the left-hand column of natural or instinctual action. That's not necessarily the case. As we'll see, there are some human beings who are not capable of intentional action, and there are some non-human animals who are able to do these things in the right-hand column. So this is going to lead us to the next question about whether it's possible to commit a wrong against a non-human animal. So if we wanted to answer yes to that question, we might say that animals have some interest, for example, in avoiding pain and suffering. Whereas if you wanted to answer no, you would say that only human beings' interests are morally relevant. In other words, human beings have interests that we ought to consider when we're making ethical decisions. And even if animals have interests, they're not morally relevant. So in that view, if you were to take the no approach to this, you might argue that our conduct pertaining to animals, how we ought to treat animals, might be constrained by our obligations to other people. For example, I shouldn't harm your dog out of my obligation to you, not out of my obligation to your pet. But it wouldn't be possible under this view to answer no, that to wrong the animal itself, because the idea would be that the animal, him or herself, doesn't have any interests. So this is going to lead us to our next point on the question of animal intelligence. And you have a couple of videos posted that illustrate the intelligence of some non-human animals. One is a link to a video about Coco the gorilla. Coco's a gorilla that was raised by human beings, taught sign language, and is able to communicate quite sophisticatedly using sign language. The second video is a video about an experiment done on crows or ravens, in which they are able to use reason to solve a problem about how to get some food. So I encourage you to look at those videos. But in general, when we're talking about animal intelligence, if we just take even a cursory look at the animal world, we'll see that a lot of animals are more highly intelligent than we thought they were. So, for example, to go back to the desire for relationships, we know that a lot of animals, including elephants, which is what this image is that you see here, have strong relationships among their family groups and among their larger groups. So this is an elephant in Africa who has come across the carcass of a deceased elephant and is responding to this. It's not just walking along as if to, and it keep going along on its way. So she's got her trunk wrapped around the deceased elephant's tusk, maybe trying to ward off that hyena there that is probably looking for a snack. And then we have animals that are able to use tools, kind of like in the video of the crows on YouTube that I posted. Here we have two examples of animals using tools. The left is an otter. Otters like to eat clams and other cephalopods, other bivalves, and they have a hard time getting them open though. So what otters do is they get a rock and they float on their back and they beat on the thing with the rock until they're able to get the meat out. On the right, we have a dolphin, and the dolphin's using a sponge to protect its snout as it digs around for stuff that it wants to eat on the ocean floor. So these are examples of emotions and relationships and problem-solving tools that are worked out by the animals themselves. These are not things that were taught to those animals by human beings, that tell us that animals are more intelligent and are more capable of intentionally creating interests than we might give them credit for. So this is going to lead us to the question of whether we can and should draw a clear line between non-human animals and human beings. So here's Coco the gorilla. That's her pet kitten that she was very attached to. There are similar abilities between humans and animals in a lot of instances. So what we need to ask is whether there's something demonstrably special or unique about human beings. So the reason why I have the word demonstrably in there, that means something that we're able to actually show or demonstrate, is that we can't just claim that there is a difference that's intangible or that we can't articulate. We have to be able to say, here's the thing that makes human beings special, unique, and distinct from animals. Here's the one thing that all humans can do and that all animals cannot do. So that's a difficult question for us to answer for a variety of reasons. And that's mainly because of the issue of marginal cases. So marginal cases is just a philosophical term that we use when we're talking about things like animal ethics, as well as other issues as well, that shows that there are always going to be atypical examples, both within the human community and from the non-human animal side as well. So the idea here is that there are going to be human beings, like these infants here in this first picture, who don't possess any of the abilities that we might put forth as abilities that we think make human beings special, different from animals. So these babies here, they're pretty newly born. They're not able to do any of the things that we think are so important to humanity. They're not able to reason. They're not able to speak or communicate using words or any other form of symbolic language. They are not able to intentionally form relationships. We don't know about their emotional level. So they're really pretty minimal in terms of what they're able to do. They don't have a lot of interest beyond sort of eating, sleeping, and having some kind of physical connection with the caretaker. So they're a marginal case in the sense that they don't possess all the typical abilities that a human being would. There are other humans that might fall into this category as well. People at the very end of life who begin to lose their abilities and acquire some disabilities might also be marginal cases, or people who were born with certain intellectual disabilities who never were able to acquire, for example, the ability to reason or the ability to communicate. All of these are human beings that are marginal cases because even though they're human, they don't possess these typically human abilities. And then on the other side, we have animals who possess abilities beyond what a non-human animal is expected or assumed to possess. So I just have two examples here, but we can go back to the videos that I posted on YouTube or the images that I showed you earlier of the animals using tools. There are animals, and I don't mean individual animals like this one chimp and this one monkey, but species of animals that seem to possess many of the abilities that we thought made human beings so special. The ability to solve problems. We have a chimp down here doing rudimentary math. We had Coco the gorilla who is able to communicate using sign language and express even feelings and emotion. We have elephants who are able to create works of art. So all of these are marginal cases from within the animal community that show us that animals are not these sort of unthinking lumps that we once thought they were. So marginal cases are what really tends to complicate animal ethics, because we're unable, once we consider marginal cases, to say, well, all humans are able to do this and that's what makes them so special, and all animals are not able to do this and that's what makes them different. So keep this in mind as we move forward to look at the philosophy of Regan, who's going to argue for animal rights, and then Marianne Warren, who's going to disagree on some points and argue for a less strong stance on animal rights.